Mr Speaker.
Jacinda Ardern.
Mr Speaker, it's my pleasure to take a call in this final reading of Sue Moroney's paid parental leave bill, and perhaps I need to start by correcting the record. The Minister who just resumed his seat stood and told the House that if Labor cared so much about this issue, why didn't it do anything for paid parental leave when it was in government and running a budget surplus? I find that extraordinary that the Minister who claims to have responsibility for this area doesn't know the history of paid parental leave. It was introduced, Minister Woodhouse, by the previous Labor government. Let me repeat that again. Paid parental leave was introduced by a previous Labor government. And can I just point out that at the time it was introduced in 2002, they opposed the introduction. They opposed the introduction of paid parental leave when at that time in 2002 we had a surplus of $2.5 billion. It was absolutely financially responsible for Labor to say we have the ability to do this, it is the right thing to do, and it was National who opposed that we did that. And in 2004, because we didn't just introduce it, we extended it. In 2004 we looked to extend it and expand and extend it again. National again opposed it, and at that point we had a surplus of $5.6 billion. Again, it was possible to do it. We did it in a fiscally responsible way, and it was the right thing to do. Perhaps if the Minister missed all of those points, he might like to be reminded of the National Party's positioning at that time, because it wasn't just opposition on monetary grounds or fiscal grounds. It's not that they stood up and said, lovely idea, but we really can't afford to do it right now, because at that time they were begging for tax cuts. They knew that we actually could financially afford it. That wasn't the rationale for which they opposed it. They opposed it because they ideologically didn't believe in it. They ideologically didn't believe in it. Anne Tolley in 2002, and I quote, said, "This legislation shows how the Labor Alliance government is stuck in the radical feminist era of the 1960s and 70s and is completely out of touch with the women of the 21st century." Anne Tolley never supported paid parental leave. Those were her words. Nick Smith said that the draft bill was a, quote, dumb bill. Paul Hutchison said that it was cementing state dependency rather than incentivising individual responsibility. What, for an infant? I don't even know what he means by that statement. And Judith Collins in 2004 said it was another example of this government using taxpayers' money to try and win some votes. I find it absolutely rich for that minister to try and tell this side of the House that we've never believed in paid parental leave, when it is that side of the House who are only supporting it for the pure politics, because when you strip it away, they still don't even believe in the concept of supporting women and newborn children when they're unable to work at the most vulnerable period of a child's life. Dependency. Out of touch with women, harking back to a feminist era of the 1960s. Well, actually, if it is harking back to feminism, that's not something I would apologise for. But the point is, that government is only extending paid parental leave because of the hard work of Sue Moroney and the support of parties like the Greens and like Labor and like New Zealand First. That is why they eventually shifted. Now, if we want to talk about anyone being out of touch, it would have to be the government. Only yesterday, a report was released by the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study. 7,000 children are part of this study. It's the most in-depth study we've seen of children, tracking them from birth into adulthood. And that report has found that in more than 50% of New Zealand mothers experience hardship between late pregnancy and the first 9 months of their child's life. I'll repeat that again. 50% of New Zealand mothers experience some level of hardship between late pregnancy and the first 9 months of their child's life. And here we are arguing that we can't afford to do more to support those families in the most vulnerable period of their child's life. And that is not just something I'm saying off the cuff without research and evidence. You don't even have to look at the UN's feedback and, of course, supporting breastfeeding in the first 6 months. That stands on its own. But people like the Brainwave Trust have long argued that if you want to invest anywhere, invest in those first critical months of a child's brain development and life. Their connection with a parent is critical. It's what determines whether or not they're able to build trusting relationships in adulthood. It determines whether or not, for instance, they'll experience some of the behavioural issues that we then grapple with as taxpayers further down the track. Conduct disorder, something that is connected to whether or not a child forms those trusting relationships and bonds, costs the taxpayer $1 million per child. $1 million. And we're being shown what we need to do about it, and yet we turn a blind eye. We literally cannot afford not to do things like what Sue Moroney has proposed in this bill. So if we want to talk about cost, that is where the real cost exists. And if we want to talk about being in touch with what new parents are experiencing, we should be looking at the evidence like the longitudinal study of growing up in New Zealand. Interestingly, when they first interviewed mothers before they gave birth, their plan was to go back into the workplace, to use up what paid parental leave they had and then return. What they found was a number of mothers would use up that paid parental leave, then they would try and use up all their holiday leave, they would then try and take unpaid leave, they would do everything they could once baby arrived to stay with that child as long as they could. And that was when mothers started exiting the workforce. When they used up all of that, realised that they weren't ready to go back, and then they exited. So if that minister was really serious about trying to maintain bonds with the workforce, he would recognise what the evidence was telling him and maintain that link via decent paid parental leave. That is what would make a longer term bond to the workforce. And that is what he should be looking at and listening to. That would demonstrate that he was truly in touch with what New Zealand families are experiencing. And that was the kind of information that we as a Labour Party looked at when we established our Best Start policy. Not only did we ensure that paid parental leave in our policy would be 26 weeks, after that we said that actually for the rest of that year we wanted an additional contribution for those families to ease the burden that almost any family, no matter what their financial circumstance, experiences in that first year of life. And we absolutely stand by that policy. It is the right thing to do, and it is the most cost-effective thing to do, Mr. Speaker. I want to use the last moments of my contribution to pay respect to Sue Moroney and the work that she has done on this bill. The audacity of the minister to claim that she's confused politics and passion. There is no harder thing than to compromise as a politician. And yet when Sue Moroney saw an opportunity to try and, at least if she couldn't get 26 weeks through for every family, at least try and do that for families who experience a premature birth or a multiple birth or have a child with a disability. She compromised her bill in order to try and at least make gains for some families. That demonstrates that this was always about the issue more than it was about the politics. It was always about the issue. And it is extraordinarily disappointing that that government has been unwilling to accept that sometimes when you see a good idea, you should vote for a good idea, regardless of who puts it up. Labour votes with National on good ideas. That's what we do. That's what a good opposition does. What a good government should do is recognise that a good idea can come from the opposition as well. And I'm saddened that on behalf of New Zealanders they did not recognise that. So let it be said, Mr. Speaker, and let it be on record, that when that side of the House comes before this Parliament and brings a bill that will allow those families to access greater paid parental leave, that it was Sue Moroney who did that for them, because there is no way that government deserves any recognition.
The next call is a split call. I call